The reptilian brain and the empathetic brain. These are two different parts of our brain and our functioning. The reptilian brain, it's a strange label, isn't it? But it's an ancient part of our brain, and it's basically our survival instinct. And from the time we are born, and perhaps even before we're born, we have this sort of, wish to be, like an innate wish or need to be happy, to feel good. And that usually comes with the feeling of safety. So if we at all ever feel unsafe, we feel vulnerable, then the reptilian brain sort of leaps into action in order to protect us and preserve our safety and well-being. Unfortunately, a lot of the time we look for this happiness, and we're sort of programmed to think about finding our happiness through our societies and the messages we get from our societies, which very often, in our education systems, which very often is looking for that happiness and well-being in acquiring things, material things, acquiring status. But unfortunately, when we look to those things outside ourselves, we're constantly being disappointed. They're not a reliable form of refuge for us, just purely because of the way they exist. So everything in our world is constantly changing. It's not a reliable sort of anchor to hang on to. At the same time as having this sort of, focus on ourselves that our societies and our education seem to kind of guide us with, is this focus on me. We have this other part of our brain that is an innate quality that research is starting to see. As Darwin talked about, sympathy is the strongest human emotion. So he also talked about sort of survival of the fittest. So these seem to be quite contrary. But the empathy that we talk about, this innate quality, is about connection. The way we come into the world is about connection. Our very life depends on others, from conception all the way through to death. So we are wired to connect. And this nurturing quality that we depend upon from the time we're conceived, from conception, is this sort of innate empathy. And every being has it, particularly mammals. So they nurture their young, as we saw in that little bit of film. They nurture their young, they nurture and care for each other. And yet if we focus on ourselves and just thinking about ourselves and our own happiness, that reptilian part of our brain is really busy protecting ourselves, protecting our ego from hurt, from disappointment, and we start to build walls around ourselves, being concerned, are we going to be rejected by that person? Are we going to fail? What will people think of us? So we start to build walls rather than bridges and rather than connections. A researcher, an interneural biologist in LA, UCLA in California, talks about attunement. And his research shows that actually listening, just purely listening, single-pointedly, non-judgmentally to another person, triggers the same response in the brain as is triggered with empathy. So one of the great ways to start to develop a more empathetic sort of way of responding to our world and being in our world is just purely by listening and learning to listen to another person's story. I call this the sort of lost art of listening. In this life today, we're so busy and so caught up, in our lives and rushing here and rushing there, and we don't really have the time to stop and connect with others. And connection is becoming more and more brief through our texting. Just text, a few words, and that's even reduced to sort of symbols. So this lost art of connection is actually reducing the amount of empathy and breaking down those connections. So we're going to do a simple activity now that I've lined you up for. We're going to begin with just sitting comfortably, back straight. We're going to focus on the breath coming and going through our nose. Okay? And we're going to notice if our mind wanders. And if we notice our mind wandering from our breath, simply coming in through our nose, filling our lungs, filling our tummies, and then out through our nose. If we notice our mind wandering, gently bring it back to the breath again. Okay? So let's start with that. Nice deep breath in through your nose and out through your nose. If you notice your mind wandering, gently bring it back to the breath. I want you to reflect for a moment on an experience that you've had in your life that you would say had a really positive impact on you. Really see that experience in your mind. How does it feel? What thoughts come up? How did it make you feel about yourself? Now I want you to turn to your partner and decide who will go first. And there'll be a speaker who will share your experience. The speaker will share experience with your partner, and your partner just needs to listen. And I want you to listen just like you've been observing your breath. And if you notice your mind wandering from your partner's story, again, gently bring your focus back to listening to them. And your partner will have 2.5 minutes to speak, at which time I'll give you a heads up that it's time to stop. And then the listener needs to recap, in essence, what their partner has said. And you have 45 seconds to do that. And then we're going to switch roles. And the listener will have a turn to share their story with their partner. And so on. So ready to start? Begin. So I'd like to invite you to be researchers, fellow researchers on the development of empathy and compassion. And if this at all felt good or resonated with you, and you felt something where you actually a feeling where you resonated with your partner in some way and felt connected, then I invite you to look on your card that you received today. It's got our website. And write to us, info@creatingcompassionate cultures, and share your research, okay, on developing empathy and creating a more caring, compassionate world.